Hello and welcome back to Reality Check, and we're now at that point where we try and answer some of your many questions with answers. I can't always guarantee I can give you an answer, but we can certainly give it a good go. And to help me here is Alex. Alex, thanks so much for joining us again. Please fire away.
All right, thanks for having me. This week we have a lot of people online asking about Elon Musk's interview on Joe Rogan. They were talking about UFOs, UAP. People want to know what you think of Elon's response.
Okay, so Elon Musk, in his interview with Joe Rogan, made a particular comment that I think a lot of people have picked up on. That he said that he has a very broad security clearance because of his SpaceX obligations, and that, quote, he would know whether Boeing, Lockheed Martin, or Northrop Grumman were in fact in possession of non-human technology. And he said adamantly to Joe Rogan that he, as far as he was aware, he did not know of any such claims that they were in possession of any non-human technology. I'm sorry, I just don't believe Elon. I'm calling it. I think Elon has been read into the program, and I don't think he can talk about it. That's certainly what I've been told by people, that Elon Musk has been read in to aspects of the program. And frankly, if you accept what people like Christopher Mellon, former very senior Defense Department official, say, which is that it's routine for space satellites and craft in orbit to see strange objects, anomalous objects in orbit, it's kind of understandable that you would want the principal of SpaceX and probably the senior people that he works with to be briefed in that there are certain national secrets that need to be protected. I'm sorry, I just don't accept that Elon Musk is telling us the full story. And I am told reliably by people that he has been read in. End of story.
All right, the next question we have is from Mike. This is via email. He said, if you had the opportunity to interview Donald Trump and you were only allowed to ask him one question about UAP, what would that question be?
Mr. President, hypothetically, if there was a non-human intelligence engaging with this planet and it's been kept secret for a very long time, what would be the reason why you would accept a need to suppress that secret? Because you've made so many promises that you're going to tell the truth, that you're going to be transparent about UAPs, UFOs, and so far you haven't delivered. What would the secret be that would stop you from disclosing that to the public?
Speaking of secrets, we had a couple people online, and we have a person named Dean from X asking what you know about a large government building that was created to hide a UFO and the location of that.
And I've said countless times, and I'm sure Dean and his colleagues know this well, and they somehow think I get embarrassed about having to talk about this. I don't. I've made it very, very clear. I cannot reveal the location of an object which I am told is a non-human craft of such substantial size it could not be moved. It can't be moved from that location for a whole series of very sensitive reasons, because it's a very, very sensitive national security area. And there's a genuine concern that because of the facility built on top of it, it could jeopardize the lives of young men and women working in the best interests of both of our countries to reveal that location. And frankly, I don't care if people have a go at me and basically say, oh, you should reveal this. You have an obligation to reveal all. You don't understand what journalists' roles are. Journalists are patriots as well. They're national security responsive as well. And when somebody from the national security system who I respect says to me, look, you should know about this, but at the same time, please don't reveal the location, I will respect that. Journalists are not in the game of irresponsibly revealing things that jeopardize national security and put young men and women's lives at risk.
We have another question from a user on X. This person is asking, have you ever heard of the Technology Management Office?
It's not called the Technology Management Office. I think what you're referring to is what used to be known as the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Global Access, in the continuing efforts by the Central Intelligence Agency to conceal the role of the office that is principally involved in the UAP cover-up. They've done what all good cover-up artists do, and changed its name. And in fact, the correct organisation name, I'm told, is the Transnational and Technology Mission Centre, formerly known as the Office of Global Access. And this came out in a recent FOI request that was published by my good friend Christopher Sharp. And I noticed on a tweet from a guy called Dustin Slaughter. But yes, I'm aware that the Office of Global Access has recently renamed itself the Transnational and Technology Mission Centre. And I can only assume that the reason that they do that is to try and make it harder for us to know where they are and who they are. But we know who you guys are, and we are on your trail.
We have a viewer named Maxwell from Detroit, Michigan. He emailed us saying he's a big fan and he wants to know, Ross, if there is something that made you start looking into this more. Was there a particular guest or story that you covered that convinced you that this was something that needed further research?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite open about this. In my book, In Plain Sight, I talk about the meeting I had with a guy called Nat Kobitz, who was essentially a former chief geek, chief R&D guy for the US Navy. And Nat, sadly, he was a very, very decent and honourable man. Very sadly, he was dying from cancer when I contacted him. And maybe because of that, he felt more able to speak candidly because he knew there was nothing they could do to him. But he told me that he had been read into the craft retrieval program, that he'd been read into a program where the United States was actively involved in the retrieval of non-human craft. And this was a former very senior scientist with the US Navy. He'd actually run the scientific research out at a place called China Lake, and he'd coordinated the United States Navy's research into a whole series of areas. And he admitted to me that the United States had recovered multiple craft. It was pretty much at that point, which happened very early in my research for my book, that I realized I wasn't going to be doing, which is what I'd thought I'd be doing, which is writing a book that debunked this whole UFO nonsense. I followed the evidence, as a journalist should, and the evidence led me to the conclusion that the United States is indeed, and has been for some time, recovering non-human technology.
All right, we have another question from a user on X. Lindsay is asking, Ross, they love your work. They said, you've probably been asked this 1,000 times, but any updates on the metallic sphere that Gary Nolan was going to inspect and analyze?
One of the problems we have with trying to get an analysis of those metallic spheres is we can do an external assay of the metal in those spheres, but we can't cut them open. And the reason why is because the people, I think there's about 7 people that we're aware of who have possession of these spheres, and all of them have very kindly agreed to allow us to do some tests, including scans. But the problem is, to actually see what's inside, you've got to cut them open. And a lot of them, most of them, everyone we've spoken to, don't really want us to damage or destroy their spheres, whatever they are, because they perceive them as potentially having some kind of value. So we're in negotiations at the moment to get a scan done. And really, frankly, what's holding me back is getting across to the United States, getting the resources together to transport the sphere by road, because it can't be flown. No airline will take these things, and it has to be driven a very, very substantial distance. It'd be quite a road trip. Roscoe with a giant metal sphere sitting on the seat beside him, probably strapped in with a seatbelt, not quite knowing whether it's alien technology or not. It'd be a funny sequence. But yeah, we are, without giving away too much, we're talking to someone who's very kindly offered to allow me to scan one of these spheres. And the logistics for me is getting to the States and being able to move it from one location to another to make this happen. People need to understand we do this work on the smell of an oily rag. We're not hugely resourced. I live in Australia, and for me to get to the United States and meet these trusted people is a big operation. And that's happening very, very slowly.
All right. David from X has a two-part question here. Ross, do you think we're seeing two distinct attempts at disclosure emerge? First, the continuation of the congressional route with whistleblowers, evidence eventually leading to more information being officially disclosed. The second, the new, more do-it-yourself route led by people like Jake Barber, seeking to improve the reality themselves, and then the new private sector investment to help discover and develop technology. And do you think one of these is potentially more successful than the other, or could be?
Oh boy, that's a hard one to call. I mean, clearly there are still some in Congress who are pushing for the return of the UAP disclosure laws to be put before the Congress for a new vote. I'm a little bit despairing, frankly, about Congress's level of interest in this subject matter. Clearly, the new president, President Trump, has not issued a executive order for the release of UAP files, as he promised he would do. People should be writing to the new president and demanding to know why he has not issued that executive order. It's a bit of a slap in the face, actually, for a lot of people, because he's given executive orders for the release of the JFK files, the Epstein files, MLK, RFK, but we haven't seen any kind of move to release the UFO files that he so prominently and adamantly promised whilst he was competing for the presidency that he would release. So I'm a bit, frankly, disconsolate about the prospects of this new administration honouring its promise. Has the new president wimped it? I suspect he may well have done.
Ross, the last time we spoke and did a Q&A, someone had asked about what European countries know about UAP. Another person from YouTube is now asking if we know anything about countries in Asia, and same with the Middle East.
Look, I am in touch with people from Japan, China, and the Middle East. That's all I can say right now. Oh, by the way, just coming back to the previous question, I didn't really respond to the question's aspect relating to Skywatcher. I'm very, very optimistic about Skywatcher. A lot of people seem to think it's some kind of CIA false flag operation because of Jake's past associations with the intelligence community. But I can assure you, it's sure as hell not operating with the legislative fiat or the authorization of the CIA. They would dearly love, I'm sure, for Jake and his team, Jake Barber and his team, to shut the hell up and go away and never talk about it and do what they're trying to do. I mean, what they're actively trying to do is to invite the landing and the retrieval of a non-human craft. And that's a big call, of course, but if they can pull that off, I think that would be epoch changing. All of a sudden, the debate would change in an instant. So, yes, just to finish the previous question, I do think that probably the most positive aspect of potential disclosure right now is a potential revelation from Jake Barber and his Skywatcher team.
We do have a question.
Returning to the Asia thing, I'm very sorry I can't reveal much more at the moment. I am in touch with people across Asia, mainly about sightings. It's quite clear that, contrary to the perception that's been, I think, quite improperly and falsely led by the Federal Aviation Administration, that all of these drone overflights, so-called, are authorised. I don't see how the FAA can possibly have authorised drones across multiple countries in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Europe. Whatever these so-called drones are, the objects are still showing themselves, and I'm getting multiple reports from people in China, Japan, and other parts of Southeast Asia.
Speaking of Skywatchers, we do have Mav here asking a question on X, saying, is that team taking any precautions during summonings to avoid radiation injuries like Barber and the team received during one of their retrieval missions?
That's a very good question. I'm sure they are. I haven't yet been able to join the Skywatcher team during their hopeful summonings, but I know that they are very wise to the risks. And one of the people advising them, of course, is Professor Gary Nolan, whose area of expertise includes the dangers that people exposed to anomalous phenomena have suffered, including injuries, physical injuries. So I'm sure they're taking all that in due course.
A viewer via email asks, Ross, do you think that there are other countries that might come forward with disclosures before the US? And then what would that look like for us?
I think this is one of the key issues. It's a really good question. That I mean, I've often I've been told by people in the know that the Russians and the Chinese, probably the French and the Israelis, know full well that there is this non-human intelligence engaging with this planet. And it really does beg the question, why doesn't one of these countries come forward and embarrass the United States for frankly lying to its public? What could be more undermining if you were an enemy of the United States, if you were Vladimir Putin or President Xi wanting to cause mischief? Wouldn't it be a delicious irony that countries that are indeed authoritarian were the ones that would expose the fact that the United States has been so blatantly lying to its public? I think there must be an explanation for that. And there is talk of agreements. I noticed that when David Grush did his interview with me, he acknowledged that one of the issues that he was allowed to discuss, at least in part, in his DOPSA approval was the issue of potential agreements. And by implication, what we're talking about there are agreements between non-human intelligences and human governments. And I have to admit, I don't know a lot about perceived agreements, but could it be that there are agreements that constrain what the public is allowed to know? Yeah, it could be the case, but it would be entirely speculative on my part. I have no insights into what the nature of those agreements are.
Jules from YouTube asks, what happened to the guy in Ross's early documentary who filmed orbs and ended up terribly injured? Did he receive the help he needed to survive?
The guy I think you're talking about is a very dear friend of mine, Damien Knott, who's an Australian guy, made a fantastic film called Australian Skies, so Australian with an E. And it's a great film. And Damien, for much of his life, has been able to, for some reason, attract or draw the phenomenon. And he's filmed it repeatedly and captured quite extraordinary imagery. Sadly, actually, within a few days of he and I speaking on one occasion, way back, I think in 2016, he was filming an object at, I think, about 1,000 feet above his house. And I don't want to get the details wrong, but it dropped suddenly and somehow irradiated him in his backyard. And I've seen medical reports and I've spoken to doctors who've been involved in assessing his injuries, and they tell me that his injuries are consistent with exposure to some kind of intense, possibly gamma radiation, which is really concerning. I mean, I don't think these objects, well, I'm told that these objects are not malevolently inclined, but there are warnings that if you get too close to them, then you can be irradiated, and it is dangerous. So it could be perhaps that there is some unintentional risk of exposure that's caused when you get too close to these objects.
Speaking of danger, we have a question from Jared via email. He asked how investigating UAP has affected you with regard to personal safety, wants to know if you take any proactive measures to keep your sources secret. Do you ever feel like somebody's following you? What are the stakes when digging into a subject that the government wants to keep in the dark?
I do take extraordinary efforts to protect the security of the communications I have with the most important sources I have. I don't believe any so-called encrypted communications system known to a lot of people is secure. I use systems that are completely, I think, largely unknown to most people, and I'm not prepared to talk about those. As a journalist, look, I've covered a lot of horrific stories in my life. I think the worst experience I've ever had was being told by the principal of a bikie gang that he would chainsaw my head off if I wrote the story that I intended to write for my book about outlaw motorcycle gangs. But the cops that I told about it said to me that the best thing I could do would be to write a book and not be intimidated by that kind of nonsense. Generally, frankly, if somebody threatens you, more often than not, they don't intend to do something about it. What is more often the case is harassment. You know, there are intelligence community troll bots on the web, much, much more so than have ever existed before. Most of them created in around October, November last year. And they give themselves away on Twitter because they often say exactly the same things, use the same language, and they're all trying to sort of negatively declaim the work that myself and other investigative journalists are doing to try and investigate this story. And I think that's the most insidious way that the intelligence community operate. They're trying to discourage public interest in this subject by continuing the taboo and the stigma and the ridicule. But frankly, the degree of interest that I've seen from this audience, this wonderful audience that are listening to me now, indicates that it's just not working. I don't think people buy anymore this bullshit nonsense from the national security state that there's nothing to this subject matter. They know full well that there's a wisdom of the crowd. They're not buying it anymore, and frankly, the continuing cover-up is a pathetic joke. And it's only a matter of time, I think, before someone eventually catastrophically leaks it in a way that is deeply embarrassing for the United States and other governments. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's always a threat in any kind of story where you're telling stories that governments don't want you to tell. But I don't want to sound flippant or disregarding of that issue, but somebody's got to do it, and I am.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this week.
Well, thanks very much, Alex. And just a reminder to everybody is that when you're listening to this show, you can ask questions in the comments and we'll try and answer them next time. Or you can just send me an email at realitycheck@newsnationnow.com, and Alex and I will endeavour to get to answering them at some stage in one of our future shows. In the meantime, look forward to seeing you on the next Reality Check on YouTube. Best wishes and goodbye. Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of NewsNation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.